Maybe one question just to focus in on one specific artist. Zofia Kulik is an artist I've worked with a few times, and maybe if we associate a degree of solidarity with feminism and an idea about institutional change that was certainly part of the vision amongst many feminisms. I did a screening in Warsaw of a British feminist filmmaker named Liz Rhodes' work, and Zofia came up afterwards. And it was very interesting because they both started working in the late 60s and early 70s. I think they shared a lot of concerns, particularly about how certain kinds of institutional language had both defined and excluded them. But Zofia was clearly having a hard time coming to grips with Liz's work, and what seemed to her as a largely formalist practice rather than a political practice. But I guess, I mean, part of the reason we are all here is this notion of translating feminisms. Like, how do we start to build bridges? What narratives within modernity do we want to start to construct that can maybe talk about, maybe not a universal experience, since that word was used, but something that can, again, find a degree of solidarity across, different notions, different challenges that women have faced worldwide. But in terms of where are the women, what categories are we beginning to create to ensure that they are included, and what resonances between these different societies might there be? And I guess back to that initial question of even, when did you first encounter the term feminism? Did you immediately associate it with as a Eurocentric concept? And if so, was that a problem, or was it something that, allowed you to rethink your own practice or the practice of the women you were working with?
Respond to the...
It was a question directly to you.
No, to all of us. Thank you for your question. When did I first... I think I became a feminist even before I knew my ABC. Growing up in the 1960s in India, there was, if you looked at the notion of the single woman, and my mother was a single woman, there were three kinds of verticals, very distinct verticals, which have now sort of dissolved. There was widowhood, there was the single woman, and there was the less defined, because it wasn't so common, category of the divorced. But if you were widowed, and if there was issues of patriarchy which would involve inheritance, then the marking of a family like that was very, very distinct. You were marked, I think, because you were marked perhaps even in your own mind, because you were distinctly different. To be outside the patriarchal norm was a sign of a certain kind of a distinction. And I find that in a lot of the practices of the women that we encounter in India. Arpita Singh is one of them. In Nalini Malani, the loss of the land, the loss of the nation is so identified. In Tejal Shah, the loss of a powerful father figure in a certain sense is the same. And I think it's this notion of absence, critical absence, which drives in a certain wedge between the normative and the a certain outsideness. I think in a broader way, in India there wasn't a great sense of a suffragette movement ever, because women were given the vote along with men when India becomes independent. You didn't have to fight for the vote. You didn't have to fight to get into an art school. If there was a sudden glut of women artists in the 1970s, it was also because the Prime Minister of India from the 1960s had been to an art school. Indira Gandhi, she was a woman, though she denounced feminism. She denounced herself as a feminist. The women before her of the independence movement, Sarojini Naidu, Begum Shahnawaz, distinctly denounced feminism, though everything that they did. I mean, I find this interesting, an interesting coincidence that your entire work can be addressing itself to women. Your practice can be about social upliftment. Indira Gandhi said that 50% of the world's women live in a state of a complete disenfranchisement. She urged social reform towards women, but then denounced the notion of feminism. So there is this particular dichotomy. India lionized certain women artists. By the time she dies in 1941, the beautiful and enigmatic and charismatic Amrita Shergill is already announced as an artist of the nation. The National Gallery of Modern Art acquires or has 100 paintings of her, and they dedicate a room to her. This is not done with any other male artist. This is a great distinction that the nation confers. So to be a woman and an artist was not, as perhaps is addressed in Latin America, this was not a term of weakness. But did you propel yourself into feminist discourse is a big question. we spoke about Nalini Malani. Malani, with 3 other women in the 1980s, forms a sort of a quartet of women. Arpita Singh, Nalini Malani, Madhvi Parekh, and Nilimar Sheikh. All of them address issues of women. All of them paint women, the entire spectrum of the family, the child, to the menopausing body. But only one of them, Malani, claims to be a feminist. So I think the big issue, to answer your question, Stuart, is the discursive realm. It's not the visual. The visual seems to affirm what we believe is feminist practice.
Well, I think I don't think it's that easy to. I mean, I grew up with a really, really strong, powerful mother who was a writer in Europe. So for me, and I read Simone de Beauvoir when I was a teenager. I was more or less forced to read it and so forth. And I remember studying art history. I couldn't find a single woman that looked like me. I mean, not that I looked any special, but I mean, everybody was kind of more slim and more idealized than I was. I was like, so it must have been that the women did not paint women or something. So, so basically there was always kind of a sense of discomfort in the fact that there was no space, that there were not many, women voices. And then it was only in the 90s that I actually discovered all the kind of feminist writing related to art, not before. And then slowly I started to become more and more restless about the fact that I couldn't see these women. And I said, but if I exist, there are so many women in the world, how come that they're not there? But I feel that feminism as a discourse, and in the way that we understand it, because we went through the first wave of feminism, we went through the second wave of feminism, and then we went to post-feminism. We're supposed to have resolved in the same way we talk. It's postmodernism. We solved the issues of modern. We know that we haven't solved anything yet. We are kind of constantly in this kind of psychoanalytical way, kind of coming back again and again about these things. And I feel that for example, in Latin America, we are, and a lot of these women are fighting against a lot of issues that have to do with this kind of universal sense of this kind of patriarchal, violent society where there is few rights for women, there is a lot of violence, there is a lot of, but even the feminism there wasn't, didn't really agree on what were the real issues of feminism. Were the social issues feminist, were the sexual also for issues, and then at the same time, it was dogmatic in the sense of, how do you actually understand the subjective realm of understanding really what could be the mind of a woman beyond the militancy of feminism. And I find that the militancy is what is a little bit kind of a problem in terms of when it kind of is applied so strictly to the kind of feminist art, then it becomes like a recipe, because whenever you see kind of, a feminist cinema and so forth, it often comes like that. So, I find that, we could say that most of it is profoundly feminist, but I feel that we need to kind of call it something different. I don't know if it's, we call it informed by feminism, sort of gender-based and so forth, but I don't know if we have actually come up with a solution to that.
I would add that in Poland the situation is similar in terms that women artists address issues that we consider feminist, but they do not call them feminists. And it was also the case in 70s, and it's still the case. When in 70s there were organized exhibitions of women artists, they were always titled women's art, never feminist art. And it's today, I think it's similar. But on the other hand, I think we should not too quickly agree with similarities, yes, because I think that behind the similarities, in the situation, there are different reasons for this. So for example, in Poland, during the communist times, I think that many women artists denied being called feminist and being involved in feminist movement because they were afraid of art being a part of political movement. It was because of this tradition of communist government controlling art and this tradition of propaganda, of communist propaganda. They strongly rejected it, which is, I think, interesting. Feminist art cannot be separated from politics. Yes, they were afraid of being too close to politics, afraid of, I would say, propaganda. And then that was the reason for denying this feminist. So of course it's a little bit different today, but that's what I wanted to stress, that we have a similar situation, that also with the pictures, they seem to show similar issues addressed in a similar way. But I think that behind it there are very different circumstances, very different environments in which these women lived, actually, very different histories, personal and political histories, that we have to remember about them.
I mean, it's funny because I'm struck by, you mentioned Griselda Pollock, you think of Laura Mulvey. I mean, I guess frequently I come back to a lot of British feminism and particularly film criticism of the time, which had a huge impact in this country on a later generation of institutional critique, particularly at the Whitney program. But, in terms of those critical models that developed in other parts of the world, which were not exclusively on the terms of feminism, but as you suggest, through other militant movements, through other leftist movements. And I think it is really important to start to map how feminism or radical women, as the term you've used for the Hammer Show, I mean, how were they involved with these other movements, these other political conversations, which I think then pushes our own conversation about, how are we rewriting art history at the moment, or how are we seeking, it is discursive, I agree with you, but it is also ultimately about representation. And so to some extent it is about the visual as well. But I guess I'm also interested because I remember I also did a project with Barbara Hammer at one point, and we frequently came back to the idea of essentialist practices in the 70s. And essentialism is something I'm very interested in now because it's not a position that is easy to hold or to defend in 2014. But I'm wondering if you feel that it still enters into the conversation or if it is ever a useful position.
In Latin America, we have a term called mujerismo, which is a horrid term, which is basically to talk about this kind of essential idea of femininity, of the essential place of women in society. And of course, it's strongly based on the idea of a mother, an abnegated mother who is eventually a victim, and so forth and so forth. And and that has actually been one of the difficult things in order to relate feminism to contemporary artists who are radical. That because their art was associated to an idea of femininity, and femininity is conceived in a fixed idea. And, even Lucy Lipa, who is so brilliant, used to characterize, feminist art as soft and pink and so forth. And so I think if you really look at the practice of these women, none of them was really interested in any of this kind of aesthetic or assumptions of the feminine as such. And I think that continues to be a problem in terms of disassociating an idea of feminism in terms of this kind of, and also, there is those other prejudices to us. I think there is also a little bit of a class issue in Latin America because a lot of the social causes of women were not really the causes of some of the things that people were dealing with. And I've read long essays about, how in Latin America women, even very, very low middle class, they have a lot of help. They have a maid at home that, does everything, looks after the kids, and then you can go out. I mean, this is one of the main reasons for feminism in Europe, this kind of thing that you're having to divide, the role of motherhood and parenthood and going out into the street. It wasn't such an issue like that. So I think some of the main ideas related to this kind of femininity and the role of feminism in terms of liberating a society, it didn't really work there. I don't know if that answers the question.
I'd just like to say that the making of a certain female sensibility occurs on different kinds of registers, and there are so many variables, say, along that one vertical. It could be women and labor, women and the body, and what were the kinds of morphologies, or what were the kind of images that women could arrive at. For instance, let's take someone like Sheila Gowda. I don't have an image. In the last Kochi Biennial, she presented a work which was a work of grinding stones. She actually just visited around the city of Bangalore, these grinding stones, which would have been, in that sense, a symbol of oppression at a certain level, because this is how women used to grind the paste used for making the daily bread in their households. But as soon as there is globalization, you now have the mixie or the whatever, the food machine, which is going to be able to do it for you. So she actually found her art object just lying outside people's homes, abandoned, rejected. She picked them up. She picked up about a few hundred and cleans them up, packs them, spends a huge amount of money transporting them from Bangalore to Kerala. They become her artwork. Along the vertical of the domestic, it would be almost within the domain of a certain kind of essentialism. But it's in the way that she places them, because she places them in such a way that they are placed in a room which is moving out into the sea. And there are just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these grinding stones toppling their way back into the waters of Kerala. And this has an acutely important sense of location, because Kerala was a trading port with a lot of China and the West. And in a sense, this is a response of the artist also to global practices, to global capitalist practices. What happens when there is an entire way of life starts to disappear under these kinds of regimes? And my point over here is that when we create a larger sort of a space, like a global feminist space or something, then I think we should be a bit cautious of the kinds of pitfalls there could be, because there are nuances, there are acts which are on the cusp of practices which are, I think, beyond the ethnic, but they may be they may be deeply localized, but then within their contexts they are highly political and relevant.
I think that's a very important point. But I mean, even again, back to some of the Polish artists, I think with Zofia Kulik, of course, one of her best known pieces as part of the collective Kwiat Kulik, used her own son in a series of staged tableaus. And when we presented this in London, a lot of women in the audience reacted very strongly against the work and what they saw as the abuse or sort of the ultimately the abuse of this child in the work, which of course in a Polish context it had a completely different meaning and one that was very political. Similarly in Natalia LL's work, we feel like, the vernacular is very familiar from Western pop art, but of course she was producing it not in a Western consumer society, and actually the questions she was asking, I think, were fundamentally unique to the situation there. So there are echoes, but then that echo doesn't always necessarily originate from the same source.
Well, yes. Maybe two answers, or two parts of the answer. One is, if we are talking about transferring feminism and transferring different ideas across the Iron Curtain, yes, because it is, when you ask about feminism being Eurocentric, I would say that in Poland, as in other parts of Eastern Europe, it was West Eurocentric. Yes, it was considered as coming from the West. It was also considered to some extent as not ours. Yes. And this Iron Curtain was actually quite open. Was not closed completely. So in fact, many ideas were transferred into Poland, but we have to check very carefully how they were understood and whether they were understood, because not many texts were translated. Simone de Beauvoir, for example, was translated in 1972, but I don't know how many people read it. For example, Betty Friedan was translated just 2 years ago into Polish, the Feminine Mystique, I mean. So there was a short summary in one of the magazines, yes. So it was not, the context was not well known, and sometimes I remember one of the Polish woman artists, Ewa Partum, who was the only one that claimed to be feminist in the 70s. I remember her saying that she, it was in 75 or something like this, that she saw a book sent to her by someone, and she saw Karoli Schneemann's reproductions of her works, and she thought, oh, I am not crazy, there is someone else somewhere there doing something similar, yes? So this this kind of I think this understanding of feminism was, and also pop art and so on, was very superficial in Poland. That is one thing, and another one is a little bit related to what I said before, that Polish artists were actually quite afraid of being political. As you said, you mentioned this duo Kwiekulik, that it was political, but also it was very strongly. Many works of art, also Natalia L., were considered to be like a discussion on artistic language. It was like more on a formal level of artistic development and not so much related to the society. And it is very interesting for me with Natalia L. that her works in Poland were not seen as feminist pieces of work. They were perceived as examples of some kind of universal discussion about representation and multiplication and so on, in the 70s. And also during the 70s, outside Poland, in, I don't know, Yugoslavia, for example, but also in many other countries, they were perceived as feminist pieces of art. And that is also interesting. I think probably it's not only the case of Poland, but you have different frames, yes, different interpretatory frames. So now today we see them as part of a feminist art movement, but in Poland in the 70s there was no feminist art movement, and they were not part of feminist art movement.
Is there a mic for the audience?
I mean, it's just a note, or all because we are talking about Poland, and you just mentioned how Natalia L. has a different interpretation in Yugoslavia, for example. And I think it's an interesting information that in Yugoslavia there was a first feminist symposium, let's say, in 1978. It was called the Comrade Women, the Women Question, a New Approach. And Sanja Vekovic was part of it, Boana Page, who is a curator who did a gender check, who is actually the whole, like, mapping out all the feminist discourse in Eastern Europe. And it's from, it was a big show and also a reader. And Sanja Vekovic always says that she was a feminist artist in the 70s, like Eva Partum. So the circulation, I think, existed. And of course, it was different from country to country, but I wanted to point to this. I think it's an interesting information to know that in Eastern Europe in 78 there was already a claiming of a feminist, and it were like a lot of they also sent, there was like they sent invitation to a lot of international figures at the time. Not all came, but it was like that's how it started. And what also came to my mind when we are talking, it's the reading. The fact that in the socialist countries, there somehow their reaction in the 78, it was to show that actually, because the socialism considered the women and men equally, it was an ideological stance, and to show how actually it doesn't happen. And it's true that you consider then from the 90s, the moment of transition and democracy and freedom, it turned out that then in the socialism there were more like the feminist, actually the rights were more considered than maybe in the recent years. And also, like, talking about Lina Shapochnikov, she was not for sure a feminist artist, so it's also like very the reading also should be carefully, because Alina also was very well known in Poland. I mean, you know better than me. She was extremely well known in Poland and even in Paris. So, and the first show was in the 90s by the big retrospective. So there is, of course, there is always, I think it's important, the readings that we are giving from this perspective are very, very, have to be like carefully somehow.
She was invited to one of feminist exhibitions. I don't remember exactly now. I read an invitation letter, and she considered it to take part, but then she died. Yeah, so.
very keen to hear other thoughts from this illustrious audience. So does anybody else have a question? Do we have another?
Thank you. I'm curious about what seems to me a kind of décalage between the concept of feminism and the work we've actually been looking at tonight, which is mostly concerned with body image. I mean, it's not reflecting the concerns of Simone de Beauvoir or Betty Friedan. It's basically, you know, if you had to attach a theorist, it might be Julia Kristeva. Why the artists we've been looking at, not Polina Orlowska, for instance, whose work is political, does that make it unfeminist? Why, you know, we've been looking at work in the tradition of Anna Mendieta and Hannah Wilke and Eleanor Anton and so forth, but it seems to me that this is an oddly diminished version of feminism. What happened?
About Paulina Orlowska, but I have to answer. I had just 10 minutes, yes? I was given 10 minutes, so I am really not able to show all the women artists. And I concentrated on, in my talk, I concentrated on artists that I met, my personality met in the 90s. In the beginning of the 90s, Paulina Orlowska is quite young, actually, and she started doing interesting works of art in the next decade. And I actually find her really interesting in terms of dialogue between women, and in quite interesting in terms of writing women's history, because she made a lot of art pieces that are some kind of in dialogue with other women artists. Yes, so obviously yes, but the only thing I can do, I can recommend you several books about women Polish artists, because I am really not able to talk about every one I found interesting.
Can I just quickly? I think, I mean, I understand where you come from with your comment, but I don't agree with it. And you use the word oddly diminished version of feminism, something like this. And I think it's you know, there is one thing. I mean, when you look retrospectively at art history, which is basically what you're doing, you're looking from the present into the past. I mean, now you're even applying queer theory to things where there was none of it. And when you have an artist that is arguing very strongly why she's not a feminist, I mean, there, you know, for example, in Argentina, because feminism was so strongly associated to communist and Maoism and Trotskyism and so forth, each one had a different branch of whatever participation. Some were more went into urban guerrilla or whatever, but there was actually a real danger even for your own life. So this feminist group, or even this banda, for example, in Argentina, Movimiento Argentino Feminista, el MAF, simply because it was actually, there were disappearing people, and people were disappearing in Guatemala. So I understand, even maybe in Poland they had a different reason why, because they didn't want to be institutionalized under this idea of something which is political or party-like something. I think basically, you know, even though I think about it, we thought about it a lot. A lot of the iconography, again, I've shown very few images. I mean, Latin America is huge. There is a lot of work like Ana Mendieta, a lot of work which has to do with freeing your body and has to do about sexuality. But do we have to call it feminist from that point of view? I mean, for example, some of these had to do with, let's say, going back to understand some sort of form of, going back to some sort of idea of how indigenous cultures conceive, for example, the woman's body or the idea of the maternal, without converting that into this kind of essentialist idea of the maternal and then into a feminist thing. I mean, there are also different nuances. So my feeling is that, yeah, there is a lot of coincidence. We could just call it a feminist exhibition, but I don't really feel that umbrella at the time, as it was seen in Latin America, as it's seen, it can simply be called that. I think we need to find several different frameworks to look at the art of these people, because otherwise I think it's going to be completely unfair, and we just simply couldn't put a label. You know, even in Poland, I feel that it was closer to what it may have been in Europe and in the States. Latin America really was a different world, and it had a huge of this kind of anti-imperialist attitude towards the term feminist. It was really like that. It was kind of an important cause. So there was a distrust of that. It was a bourgeois, even a bourgeois idea. So I think
to carve out a really kind of complex historiography, I think to just say that would be a diminished kind of, I just don't know, I just have a problem with that.
Thank you. I just want to say that I would like to comment on your comment, and that's part of the problem, is that we see an image of a woman, and I actually didn't see what you saw. We see an image of a woman and you see a body. I saw an image of a woman and saw an agent of something. So, it just shows the kind of endless loop of the dog chasing the tail of what we're talking when we're talking about feminist strategies. So, yeah, there's just a comment on the comment. But I would love to hear you talk about, the panelists talk a little bit about something that I note just in even my generation in relationship to my students' generation is like how we, and maybe you can report back from your context, that I see this shift of feminism rather than it being paraded as this historical concept that you agree with or not, or that is kind of kept hostage in the past. Like, how would you, could you speak a little bit about how, like in the contemporary context, how also maybe younger generations use feminism? Because I feel what I'm seeing, which is very interesting, is that instead of it being a definition, I'm feeling, and I think that was historically true too, that women, and not only women, all kinds of artists use the term as a strategy. And I think I'm looking for, as an artist and as an educator, like I'm looking for the term as a strategy, as a political strategy, and how that term as a political strategy can be useful within the context of culture, rather than kind of debating the same stories that we all have been participating for many years, I'm sure. Like what can feminism do for us now as a strategy and as a term? I mean, we're talking about language and how we use language, and artists and theorists have used that strategically for a long time, and I think it would be really interesting to actually talk about that, to move the debate into kind of an active debate of what we can do and what we need to do now.
Can I respond to that? In the 70s, the feminist movement, did it all take place in pockets of art or also peripheral areas? For instance, publishing in India, women publishing houses start to come up, and something called the NGO sector, which has strong links with a lot of Marxist thought at that point. There is a proliferation of women NGOs, which actually address particular kinds of issues, the most predominant one being violence or unequal rights. The rights are not being properly addressed. And there is this movement, I mean, it spreads all, I mean, you can see a representation even of South Asian women over here in the United States, but there is a very strong movement in the ground in the 70s. It has strong ideological roots and it has a certain presence. Now let's take this into the 2000s, and what happens is there are two incidents which come to mind. One is the shooting of a woman in a bar because she refuses to give somebody a drink. This is an incident which happens about 9 years ago. It becomes a case. There is no redressal. And until the media and civil society step in. There's a similar thing about a rape case in India. It's extremely well publicized. In 2012, a young woman is raped in a moving bus, brutalized, thrown out of the bus, half completely naked, and dies over a period of the next few days. What would be the success or the politicization of the movement, in a certain sense, of those early shoots of the 70s, of these, somewhat marginalized sectors, is that this then becomes a kind of a civil society movement. And the entire thing snowballs. So the shooting of the barmaid, which is shot down by the courts because the boy who actually does the shooting comes from a powerful political family, this is then completely ignored until the media and civil society start to hold vigils, actually. I mean, and And there is now a locus, pretty much in the city of Delhi at least, where protest starts to take place. And it loses its ideological moorings. I think that's very interesting, and becomes a sort of a young people's form of expression. And this has happened with both of these events. It has actually forced governmental action. It is forcing the making of laws. I think in that sense, is this feminism? Is this the feminization of a larger society? I would strongly argue for that. And that becomes a film. No One Killed Jessica is a very well-known film in India.
Perhaps this is picking up on the question of generation, but it may be more pertinent to Agatha. But I was wondering how you've seen the introduction of the market or the proliferation of it remotivate these practices, and in a way that perhaps brought on an institutional acceptance that then maybe evacuated it of a certain conversation or radicality, or and whether you've seen that happen or how you've approached or kind of faced that change.
I'm not sure I exactly understand your question.
I guess I'm wondering when the market brought its certain demands for certain productivity or certain acceptance, perhaps, that maybe was on an institutional scale of work that was deemed quite dissident or quite radical and outside of those sectors. How have you seen artists negotiate or remotivate their work, or perhaps not, in those cases?
I would give one actually quite short answer to both questions because it seems somehow related to me about this usage of feminism as a strategic term, and also to artistic strategies. Yes, it seems to me that very often, actually nowadays, at least in Poland, but probably it's not only Poland, women artists strategically avoid being termed feminism. Feminists, but at least in Poland, yes, that's the case. So it's not that feminist is used as a strategic term, but it's avoided just as a part of a career strategy. Yes, and I don't know. We can ask whether it means that the work becomes less political by this omission, or less radical. We can whether we need this term feminist to be radical, to be political, or whether we don't need it. Yes, I think that's one of the questions, because I can tell you as an academic teacher that when I teach a seminar and I title it something like "Women and Feminism" or "Art and Feminism," something like this, almost no one is interested, yes. But if I title it like body, subjectivity, and art, and something like this, and I teach exactly the same, yes. But there are many people who want to come, and so it's also this kind of reluctance to just to feminism as a term, because that's what I think what you meant also.
I wanted to ask Cecilia, but before that, I just wanted to mention that I'm a feminist myself, even though it's not something that you kind of hang around your neck and walk around with. But I've worked with Ana Mendieta before she became famous, or before she died. Back in the 70s, she came to Mexico. And I started a magazine there, an avant-garde bilingual magazine in 72. And we did an issue around the art of women, and feminism, of course, was at the core of it. I already had known a lot of the feminists. I was a friend of Hannah Wilkie. And I went back and forth to LA and to New York and to Europe. So I think, Cecilia, that maybe the problem is that there's this paradigm which back then in 75 when I did that meeting of all the women artists, cross-generational. Unfortunately, at that point, we didn't have much communication with the indigenous communities. Today, we have a group of people, women, working in Oaxaca, which is a matriarchal state to begin with, recuperating a whole series of traditions. And you've just done the Biennale there in Guatemala. There's certainly a lot of work to be done there. But maybe what the issue is that this paradigm came from somewhere else, whether, you know, it's Euro-American or whether it's Eastern Europe, Western Europe, or wherever it was that it originated. I believe it was here in the United States, the whole idea of feminism. But I still think that it's valid even today to utilize it as a political strategy, definitely. And just the other day, in working on doing a presentation of Eugenia Vargas's work for someone, I realized that there was this issue, Atlantica, that did these profiles with different artists from Latin America, and a lot of women artists, by far more women artists than men. And Octavio Zaya is the editor, he still is. And this was an issue from, I believe, 1996, right after the Biennale in La Habana. And there was an extensive interview of Eugenia in which she changes the conversation. Her interviewer is I forget, he's a photography critic and Cuban, male. And she changes the subject and insists that she thinks there's a lot to be done with the whole idea of feminism, that I'd like to provide you with a copy of that. So I think that radical or feminist, whatever word you want to give it, I think there's a resistance, particularly in Mexico, I don't know the rest of Latin America, to be labeling yourself and or others, because there's also a whole political history of censorship and people disappearing and being murdered for calling themselves X or Y or Z. Thank you.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, and Eugenia Vargas, obviously, but, you know, Eugenia Vargas became overtly a feminist artist when she came to Chicago and studied in the States. And I have a conversation with her, and she said that her work changed radically. She may have had some inclination to be critical about certain iconography, but it only really came to fruition when she came here. Monica Maya, who was already some sort of militant feminist, I mean, she came to the Women's Building and saw in your magazine the article by Judy Chicago that spoke about the Women's Building, and then she went to Los Angeles, and then she somehow also formed, you know, and in Mexico, really, there are quite a few feminist artists, some of them that call themselves feminists and some that don't. But I feel that in Latin America, there has been this particular vacuum in this relationship between feminism and art, when there hasn't been this broader dialogue with a broader context of people that actually do feel that these two fields can actually kind of come together. And I still don't quite know how to bridge this problem. And I really would like that, you know, you can apply a feminist reading to a work, and I feel that a lot of the art in this exhibition, at least the one we are doing, is informed by feminism. But, you know, does that make it necessarily, you know, to which extent really we I mean, historically speaking, I feel, you know, when we talk about Latin American today, it's very different. I think a whole new scenery comes to happen after the mid-1980s. You know, the next generation of artists are much more informed about feminism. There is a lot less, you know, these are the pioneers. These are the people that really struggle to actually talk about certain things. And I think we need to discuss it in different terms. All this kind of political work against dictatorship and oppression, do we have to call that necessarily feminist work? I mean, that I don't, it's not that I'm against the word. I'm like, when an artist has worked in that way and feels that a lot of the work gets completely overseen by being described in a particular way, that is a problem. Maybe we have still to work a lot on the term feminism, but we're talking about historical terms. So, you know, I think we need to read differently. Ana Maria Maiolini is a very interesting case. She actually tackled a lot of issues that could be completely feminist, about this repetition of the kind of domestic act, this idea of making bread, making these sculptures, and this, And she was strongly criticized in Brazil by very interesting people, even Agnaldo Farias, for her work of being completely irrelevant for what it talked. But then at the same time, she worked about, you know, political issues. So I feel that there is a whole spectrum of issues to deal with that cannot be completely covered and acknowledged to simply a term of feminism that the artist herself rejected.
I just wanted to add a very brief commentary. I think it's very important to remember when we are discussing the representation of women in museums, in books, like Cecilia was saying, to remember that today only 1/4 of museum directors are women, and only 1/3 of museum curators are women in the US, and that they are paid 30% less, and that is one of the reasons that explains why there are less women in museums.
I was curious just to return back to this term of feminism, and I think we're again returning back to feminism as a descriptive term. And I was actually more curious, going back to Andrea's question about it as a strategic term, in that what about the work being done here? When we categorize something as feminism, what about the work that's being done presently here? And I think my question is actually, how does the specificity of the word itself, and any word does not meet, it's limiting. It always does not, it always slips. But what is the specificity of the word feminism, and what problems does it raise, and what discussions does that allow? I'm asking this partly because you mentioned your experience with your students. I've been teaching for a long time, and I've noticed in the past few years that any class that I teach with the word feminism has now, it's been taken by students as not as a description for a course title, but rather as a call, almost as a summons. And I'm curious about why the word has a certain urgency, and what questions, even if I might teach the same thing, it's not about the content, but it's about the how. And I'm curious about actually the work that's being done here right now under the rubric of feminism, and the specificity of the word, and how we in this present, not about whether the artist at that time, self-described or self-identified, but what questions get mobilized at this moment because we talk about it under the rubric of feminism. So I'm curious about that question.
I just want to say quickly, because I want to hear from the three of you, but I think the key thing, I completely agree with you and Andrea, and I think, the word active is the key. Keeping it an active term, not a label, but making it something that continues to have a use value and a self-critical use value. But I think the key thing here is that, we're speaking about an English word, and how does that translate, and how does the word become a palimpsest of multiple languages, multiple positions, and multiple points of view? And that's a much harder task, but one I think we have to really fight for.
Maybe short. Well, English. Now I have, because you said about feminist being an English word, and so I started thinking about it instead of your question. But in Polish, actually, feminist was as a little bit translated into Polish, so it sounds like feminism in Polish. It's almost. Yeah, it's a bit like this. And we have more problem with gender. But coming back to feminism, I think it would be. It just came to my mind. It's not that I thought about it, but maybe it would be interesting to think about feminism, a term feminism, like a performative term. Yes, that's what you thought about. Yes, but it's, if you put it into title of your course, it makes something. Yeah, so I think it's quite good idea, actually, also in terms of exhibitions, to think it in that way.
I'm interested that you said that you have a bigger problem with the term gender. In my country, actually, gender passes a lot more easily. It's less problematic than feminist. It seems to cover a much more broad rubric, particularly within academia, and it's a term that is used with a certain degree of ease.
I think I think there is a resistance. There is definitely a resistance to the label of feminist. One of the questions that Stuart did put to us, is it Eurocentric? Apart from Eurocentric, I think it is a question of what is its utility? What purpose does it serve? Unless it actually translates into some sort of action, which is the kind of proposition that was put forth over here. I mean, and particularly within the terms of the discourse of art, which is where we are now, and which is what we represent, it would be as perhaps it would be perhaps as the artist would question it almost as much as he would question the nomenclature of Indian. There is a problem of a certain sense of what is the curatorial eye? Is the curatorial eye from outside? Because then labels start. Then the Indian, then these kinds of labels they start to proliferate. But if I were, and this is what we've seen in India in the last 10 or 15 years, and certainly in other parts of South Asia, that the representing of art under the broad rubric of Indian is extremely problematic. And then to split it further, women's practice and within that feminist practice, I think that becomes, it becomes a sort of at least, or is seen as a sort of a limiting exercise. You will find some artists who embrace the term, but those are fewer and far between.
Well, I mean, in terms of strategy, I think we are aware that the art system is still quite biased towards men. So for me, for example, as someone who believes in some sort of feminist art history in the sense of kind of visibilizing women, I think I want to continue looking at and asking certain questions that maybe a male colleague doesn't ask. I mean, I've known people who I respect enormously in Latin American art who have done a lot of conceptual art, and they said that they don't want to participate in the exhibition because they don't consider that they should be speaking for women, something like that. So basically, these are things that, the struggle I've had with the exhibition I've had is so enormous that I know still how much there is to do in the field simply to say a woman can be a good artist. Honestly, I mean, sometime in Latin America we are, but in art history as a general terms, we still have to gain a lot of space for certain artistic practices. For example, someone that comes from Africa or India, there is sort of a comparing sort of thing. Who came before? There is all this kind of linear art history, and then there is further down the line comes of all this stuff. And I feel that even within Latin America, there is huge amount of prejudice towards women. So for me, I want to do everything possible to avoid pigeonholing women into a niche, which is going to be this kind of othering. So in a point that is going to actually deflect people from actually seeing the work simply because you want to see it only through a particular lens. And the idea is that you have many different frameworks for reading. In our exhibition, we're going to have a chapter of feminism, but this chapter of feminism is going to be really artists that were defining themselves as feminists. We saw some today. Some others are informed by, and so forth and so forth. So I feel that, there is a strategy that we need to kind of make sure that these women have a place and a voice to speak however they want. That is for me the point. But, and I think the position of women today is very, very different from the ones I'm actually talking here in the 60s and 70s that were literally completely fighting for their lives in a kind of a political regime. So I feel that when you kind of extrapolate immediately, 2014, New York, from, Colombia in the 1970s, I'm like calling about two different solar systems.
If I can just make a comment, rather than trying to pretend it's a question, but I'm an assistant curator at the Sackler Center for Feminist Art, so this is a question that we struggle with a lot in terms of how you sort of frame that and impose that. And for me, this question of strategy is really important because we've really gotten away from wanting to be in the position of asking artists to ascribe or have to identify as a feminist artist in order to be able to be shown, because what we really want to do is be able to ask feminist questions of anything, right? So that becomes our tool, that becomes our strategy that we can mobilize in whatever way we want, and then it gets us away also from being a place that only women artists are shown, because really I want to ask feminist questions of artwork by everybody, and I want to make visual art and visual material that maybe isn't claimed as art, and the kinds of questions that feminism opens up in relation to visual culture and hierarchies of media and all of these things as well. And so I think in the same way that at the same time I wouldn't say that you can't apply a Marxist strategy to reading medieval work, I also think that the question of imposing a feminist reading on artists who aren't thinking about themselves as feminists is not a problem, for me at least. So that's something I think if you do it all the time for a lot of material, so that it's not just women that you're imposing a feminist lens on, but actually a whole scope of approach, then it becomes something that isn't limiting to them, but actually opening up to all kinds of art. So that would be my counter idea to that kind of problematic.
Can I just add, I also just wanted to say can I just add one comment? I think it's interesting to compare this argument to lots of other art historical arguments about artists, whereas art historians, we freely feel that we can actually talk about, put different interpretation onto work that the artists themselves didn't ascribe to, or that actually makes the work more interesting than how the artist's statement actually sounds, or so I think it's interesting that bringing this question to bear on feminism, it's all of a sudden we're so confined, but I think in other isms we do this quite a lot, and it's just something to bear in mind. Yeah.
Hello, I'll stand up because I'm so short that, that no one will see me. My name is Cecilia Vicuña. I'm an artist from Chile, and I want to bring the older perspective because I started to do art in the mid-60s, and I had never heard the word feminism. And the minute I heard it, without reading a word about it, I instantly knew that I was a feminist. And so all my early art, this is before the dictatorships set in South America. So in the 60s and all the way up to 73, when the military coup happened in Chile, and there is a period of extraordinary explosion of creativity by women and indigenous women as myself, which has never been picked up, neither by the feminist theories of Chile or Latin America. So there's a whole universe of performance. For example, I did performances with my body, with other girlfriends in different parts of Chile. They have never been reproduced in any single book because it sort of goes against the incorporation of the Eurocentric and Western-centered theorization. Our perspective was more connected with the ancient cultures and with an understanding that was so emancipated, so liberated, that even today is not yet coming out. I have to say that, for example, the young artist of Chile, I have not encountered yet a single one that calls herself a feminist, but I have encountered something even more interesting than that. In Chile, in 2006, a penguin movement arose. Penguin means high school students led very often by girls. And these penguin girls, they declare themselves to be totally feminist. Many of them are lesbians, and many of them would protest to even be called lesbians because they are so free. They are not interested in any kind of labeling or anything, but they have retrieved as a battle the name of feminist. So in their honor, for example, I am now publishing my works of the 60s, placing myself naked in the cover of my most recent book. Why? Because these girls march naked in the streets of Chile, and the boys march naked along with them. So it's a very beautiful thing that is happening, and very interestingly, some literary theoreticians or art critics. For example, I saw a book called El arte está agotado. I have not read it yet. I just saw it in the internet by a Chilean thinker, I suppose, art historian. So there is this sense that art historical language is or field is a little bit backwards in relation to where the kids are moving, demanding action, demanding, you know, a new perspective. So I feel that some of us, the old ancient ones who have not yet collapsed, you know, and the new kids have something in common. And so I celebrate, for example, Cecilia's position that it would be sort of contradictory to what I'm saying, in the sense that I sense in you a willingness to speak for this incredible hypocrisy and resistance on the part of the art historical field of Latin America, you know, and to poke the finger into that hypocrisy gives me huge delight. That's all.
I think that was a very beautiful way to end this evening. Thank you all for coming, and particularly thanks to the three of you. And I hope we'll continue this conversation in Los Angeles 2017. Thank you so much. Okay.